Namaskaram. My name is Ashna, and today I'll walk you through my presentation on the construction of identities, answering the question on how has historical labor migration played an influential role in post-colonial literature. I'll be looking at the causes of labor migration. So why do workers migrate in search for higher incomes? This is the most obvious and popular reason given. The pull from higher wages in receiving countries. In this sense, high levels of unemployment and poverty in source countries act as a push factor in the decision to emigrate. The second reason is that people are lured by friends and relatives and social networks. Networks of friends and relatives already working in destination countries serve as sources of information and anchor communities for newcomers. The next one, some are interested in visiting other lands from a sense of adventure or for exploration, and the emerging demand for labor may provide the required opportunity. The last reason, cause may be fleeing from persecution and armed conflict. In a number of cases, the migrants have no choice. They simply may be forced out because of armed conflict, persecution, at-home environmental degradation. The large inflow of migrants from Myanmar or to Thailand or from Afghanistan to Pakistan are examples of dislocations caused by armed conflicts and the suppression of ethnic groups. Post-colonial literature. So these are various reflections on post-colonial literature in terms of theories and conceptions. The post-colonial theorists examine both the colonial context and literature written after colonialism. These theorists connected post-colonial literature with many fields like history, politics, philosophy, and literary traditions. The colonial countries started writing and depicting the experiences of colonization and many changes brought by independence upon individuals and their respective nations. Post-colonial writers have this thing like what they like to do. They take the language of their colonizer, English or French, for example, and turn it on its head. A writer from Fiji, for example, or Caribbean, for example, may write a novel or play in English, but he or she may twist the English around, write in dialect, make the language sound spoken instead of written, pepper it with native phrases and terms. It's still in English, but a different kind of English. So why do post-colonial writers do this? Because it's a way for them to challenge the authority of the colonial language. In fancy post-colonial theory jargon, they appropriate the colonial language. They take on the language that they used to subjugate them and use it to challenge their oppressors. Colonizers like to tell a certain story. In this story, Europeans were created to rule over them. Lesser people, for instance, the Ibo people in Africa or the Indo-Fijians in Fiji, and Europeans were designated masters of them, the rulers of the earth. Therefore, they were justified in ruling over others, as that was their destiny. Anyway, they weren't really in it for their own profit, because for them, they were enlightening the darker people. You see, they were civilizing them. Post-colonial writers have a big problem in this story. After all, from their perspective, colonization wasn't about civilization or enlightenment. It was about brutal economic exploration. And what really bothers them is the fact that this story was told and repeated by colonizers as though it were a fact. And Europeans wanted everyone, including their colonized subjects, to accept it as true. So post-colonial writers started pointing out what actually there was that there was actually more to one side than what the colonizers said. And a story that we take to be true or factual is often just one point of view or many among many. So in their work of post-colonial writers tend to play around with a juggernaut meta-narrative, that they like to draw attention to what the stories or narratives are constructed, and especially how they're always told from a certain point of view or angle. Let's look at colonialism. For many cultures around the world, colonialism was a massively traumatic thing. Imagine all of this sudden, this stranger shows up in your town or village, takes all your stuff, forces you to learn his language, only to tell you how lame you are, and then proceed to run things any way he wants. Oh, and just to add a little icing to the exploitation cake, he does this all while destroying your environment, your culture, and your livelihood. In fact, the effects of colonialism was so deep that even after independence, many countries and cultures continue to suffer from its effects. Often the colonizers' language displaced indigenous language. Many people abandoned indigenous religion after being converted to Christianity by missionaries. Even the post-colonial nations that emerged after independence were modeled along Western-style European nations with the same type of administrative bureaucratic camp. So given what a huge deal colonialism was, it is any wonder that writers from formerly colonized countries became obsessed with understanding it, representing it, and challenging it. And given that the consequences of colonialism extended well beyond the actual period of decolonization, it is any wonder that writers are still dealing with the legacy of colonialism. In post-colonial literature, you will see this valorization of cultural identity reflected in the narrative style of a literary work. For example, a lot of African post-colonial literature resembles spoken language. That's because prior to colonialism, much of African literature was oral literature. People told stories, they sang poetry to each other. So one way that African writers valorize their indigenous heritage is by turning back to these oral narrative forms that predated colonialism for inspiration. In order to justify colonialism, colonizers had to make themselves believe that the people they were colonizing were somehow lesser than they were. Otherwise, how would they go off and enslave and kill and steal from so many people? One way they convinced themselves of their superiority was by developing all kinds of stereotypes about different colonized groups. They were dangerous, they were untrustworthy, or they were lazy. A big mission of post-colonial writers is to challenge these stereotypes and show that they are based on nothing but the biasness of these colonizers. We'll look at Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. While many Africans feel attacked by the presence of Europeans within the borders of their homeland, Nigerian author Chinua Achebe recognized that English has a powerful presence in his Nigerian society, and he chose to implement it as a primary language within his literature. When scorned by Wathong and his compatriots, Achebe stoutly affirms, "I feel that the English language will be able to carry the weight of my African experience, and but it will be altered to suit its new African surroundings, the African writer and the English language." The story of Things Fall Apart is one that has united African literature arguably more than any other work of African fiction. In a historical act of prophetic humility, Achebe chose to write to Africans, but he wrote in English so that the entire world could read and comprehend the impact of colonization on the people of Africa. Moving on to The Wounded Sea by Satyendra Nandan. So V.S. Napel, he is a writer from Trinidad, Philippines. He once wrote that Indian enchanted labors to Trinidad came from an old, perhaps an ancient India, untouched by the great Indian reform movements of the 19th century. The migrants Naples referred to were part of the movement of humanity which began soon after the abolition of slavery. In response to a request by white settlers in the sugar growing colonies of labor, the British government turned to India and began to recruit workers from the populous United Provinces. And Fiji was one of the places where these workers were brought to. What V.S. Naples referred to as, in fact, was a background in which would affect the psychology of these migrant workers, migrant Indians, and would become in years to come a defining feature of the 3 million or so Indians of the Indian diaspora. Since these Indians came on the whole from a relative homogeneous part of India, they developed a language, a variant of Bhojpuri and Standard Hindi, which quickly became the language of indentured laborers, regardless of their place of origin. Such was the impact of this language that indentured laborers to these plantations from linguistic groups Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, and Bengali, for instance, quickly adopted these languages. And subsequent free migrants, too notably from Gujarat and Punjab, acquired this language with a speed that confounded linguists in order to communicate with the others. So they had to integrate to this Bhojpuri and Standard Hindi mixture of language. The population also reflected the macrosm, the caste and linguistic division of India itself. The unified experience of indentured laborers of the Gurmit Indian diaspora from the natal of Fiji, from Mauritius to Trinidad, like any ideology, however, is the strength that lay precisely in its capacity to falsify reality and project itself unwittingly, though appealingly, as an imaginary set of beliefs, which nevertheless has invoked a point of reference for purpose, for legitimation. The Indian fragment in Fiji constructed imaginary belief systems for its own self-authentication, self-generation, and legitimation, but the Indians themselves were essentially a fragment which had been forcefully wrenched from its center. For the Girmitiers, the indentured laborers, the real life in Fiji was retrospectively seen as a deception played upon them by recruiting agents, the Arkatis, who convinced them of future possibilities filled with millennium expectations. This dual process, the logic of a fragment and the process of millenniarism, led to a Fiji Indian cultural complex, which is both specific to that racial group as well as it connects it to the larger Gurmitia diaspora around the world as any fragment that it quickly becomes fossilized. The principle of dynamic growth is seen as a center of contradictions. The imaginative world of Satendra Nandan grows out of special predicament of Indian fragment in Fiji. It is built around the intuitive grasp of Gurmit ideology, which Nandan occasionally blasts open, often parodies, but invariably enters into through a process of self-dialogization. To read Satendra Nandan's fables about Fiji has been, for me, kind of a return to a past which I had repressed through something akin to racial amnesia. His fables confront me with uncanny specular images that haunt me, which rekindle a language and a cultural complex I left behind during my childhood, or which I heard about from my parents. Like a ghost from one's past, Nandan's fictions suddenly energize one's imagination, and they take back readers to a world that is no longer available. What are the consequences of Satendra Nandan's fictive world that years later remind the readers, the young readers of Fiji of their rootlessness, lack of permanence, and as of to overcompensate for an absence, for an almost perverse idolization of great yet decaying civilization. The first thing that strikes readers after reading The Wounded Sea is the enormous weight of an anxiety of influence which stalks these pages. Behind the literature of the Indian diaspora stands the gigantic figure of V.S. Naipaul. It was Naipaul who gave form to language, to the Gurmit ideology. It was Naipaul who gave the Indian diaspora a distinctive discourse and a consciousness. Two fictive figures borrowed from Naipaul, Biswas and Ganesh Pandit, sum up Nandan's character types. The tragic hero Biswas, trapped in the contradictions of the fragment and its fictions, finally fails to recognize himself in the mirror, and the comic hero Ganesh, seeking release from the Gurmit ideology through the mastery of colonial language by interjecting the Gurmit ideology and transforming it into a comic discourse. The comic heroes plunge on regardless. The tragic hero, a shadow of the totality left behind, play out Gautam's curse, from which release is possible only through Rama himself, banished. In a way, Naipaul is the literary precursor for Nandan, structure of possibility defining limits and suggesting alternatives. Great writers have the capacity to do this, since great writers, as Foucault once said, are founders of discursivity. Naipaul is the founder par excellence of the Gurmitian discourse. What other writers of the Indian diaspora will have to do is embellish that discourse, add to it, challenge it, destabilize it, and yet recognize the founding discourses, like those of Marx or Freud, can never be dislodged. In this respect, I believe Satyendra Nandan adds to the Naipaul discourse through a writing which modifies it, where Naipaul, the monolingual Gurmitia, transformed a Hindi discourse into English. Nandan brings the discourse of the colonized to the fore, thereby simultaneously appropriating and abrogating the language of the colonizer. Moving on, the center in Nandan's fiction is also the self, the beginning of all the narratives of the writer himself. This is not to say what we have here are simply autobiographical pieces. No, that is certainly not the case. In fact, Nandan transforms his memorial reconstructions. Here, the narrator's own sympathies never remain fixed as other voices destabilize. The seemingly monolingual imperialism of the narrator as a consequence of a plethora of voices evade. And Nandan's text as also as the various utterances of the grandfather, the son, the Fijians, the schoolmaster, or the priest struggle for the momentary ascendancy. In Mahabharata, such multiplicity of voices is marked by the use of Sanskrit verb uvaka, said or spoken, alongside to the speaker to indicate his or her quiet, independent narrative presence. Furthermore, the narrative of Rama's banishment is also an underlying structural imperative of Fijian Indian culture and society. Its force lies not in vulgar homolization as if Fiji Indians consciously played out this structure. Rather, it is as a function of the complex transformational of the fossil society itself, as it attempts to construct a narrative to explain its own existence in terms of the only available and short discourse in which a similar this act of displacement or banishment had been documented. Satendra Nandan's work expresses the agony of banishment in other forms, but the narrative are written against the backdrop of this primal displacement, banishment. Thus, the complete inclusiveness of the village world, its closed world order, and most importantly, its myths and idioms are informed at every point by a complex transformational process, which finally left the Fiji Indian with an ideology which was dated and bereft of any revolutionary impetus. Moving on, the peculiar logic of the Indian psychology and even the Indian psychology and the inevitability of the Fijian rebellion seem to me prohibitively implicit in Satendra Nandan's fictions. In this respect, The Wounded Sea offers both representations of the fragment as well as its simultaneous critique. If literature is to be critically read as much by the unsaid, the marginalized, by the said, the central, then Nandan's curious absences, negations, and self-enclosed imaginative walls are equally important points for entry of the purposes. Furthermore, when we look back at Nandan's work, or The Wounded Sea, it is a kind of a black hole theory of a race relation in which self-sufficiency and gestalt replace interaction and mutual dependence. And in this crucial sense, Nandan is never able to transcend the blinkered racial lebesweld of the Fiji Indian. Thus, when the Fijians do invade the text, they are there as already formed texts, as racial stereotypes such as the comic village chief and the screaming brothers of the Fijian girl framed finally as an essential part of the text. It is informative at this point to recall the way in which the entire tradition of the Kabbalic and stactology is so much more powerfully deployed by another Pacific writer, Epeli Haufa, in his hilarious Kisses in the Netherlands. Here we get an ethnographic narrative that uses the oral traditions of the culture of the informants and the graphs and graphs them upon a massively silenced underside of the novel. Moving on, throughout The Wounded Sea, the generic conventions and discursive domain of comedy mediates between the irreconcilable yearnings of the rootless fragment for its past and its desire to opt into new land. Humor, as any reader of Naples' Miguel Street would remember, is one way of bypassing censure and self-criticism. But the comic dimension is also precarious, since it cannot finally prevent the hero from relapsing into madness. Those by whom the gods wish to destroy are first transformed into comedians and madmen. In this regard, the hero's own affair with Joan is superimposed upon the fascination with things Indian upon the citiness of Indian as it arose out of the fragments reading of the preeminent text of the Hindus, the Ramayana, Our Fate in Fiji, with Nandan writes, had echoes of the Ramayana, exile, suffering, separation, battles, but no return. Yet this India too, through other forms of mediation, is never available to the Fiji Indian as in its true historic form. Its contradictions, its own multiplicities through linguistic, religion, and cultural are glossed over and replaced by its artificial projections. Moving on, Indian diaspora generally, Satendra Nandan's Writing is a cure for the return of the repressed. And out of this juncture or conjunction, Naden's fictional autobiographical pieces, which represent the essentially tragic world of the Fiji Indians. It is a comic dimension, it's a comic dimension, social reality, since it is seen as an unconscious survival. Since strategy is always around the corner, comedy alone cannot triumph over, even if momentarily. The immense rootlessness of the fragment. Satendra Nandan's tales explore a fragment society's searching for coordinates and a center. Though the center is never found, the pathos of the search continues to be played out through the comic mode. Mr. Krishna Dutt, another labor minister in the Bhavandra government and the character who snores heavily in the fourth part of the Wounded Sea. He has his own version of the events narrated by Nandan at this juncture. And of course, sustained them during those terrible days of political incarceration in Warren House. Behind the immense laughter and generosity of the Fiji Indian lies a trauma of almost proportions. The day of the colonial made the trauma a condition of being, since the midst war constructed to ward off certain insanity that were forever destroyed, like the tale of the ancient mariner and the act of writing. That can only gesture the helplessness of the Indian people, of the indentured laborers in Fiji. To conclude, in fact, as post-colonial literature deals with framing identities, the politics of rewriting, translations, relation between nation and nationalism, it is most dominant form of literature, and it has a great appeal. Post-colonialism mostly deals with many concepts like cultural, political, geographical, psychological, and post-structural, etc. It is also major literature which helps in understanding both the cultural, the colonizer and the colonized. In many concepts like education, politics, geography, culture, and customs. Post-colonial has many common motives and themes like cultural dominance, racism, quest for identity, inequality, along with some peculiar presentation styles. Most of the post-colonial writers reflected and demonstrated many thematic concepts which are quite connected with both colonizer and the colonized. White Europeans continually accentuated on racial discrimination for their superiority over the colonized. Thank you for listening. That's all from my side.